Thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you very much for inviting me here and giving us an opportunity to talk about some of our work that we have done here in India. And I should mention then that this is joint work together with Raj, who is here, and then Sherry and Joshi, both at Georgetown University. And I should also say that I'm really the junior of the team in the sense that I've been involved in the project the shortest time. So if you have any complicated questions, you should really address them to Raj, and in the worst case, we can always call Sherry in the US. So you can actually get answers to your questions. So we're going to talk specifically then about self-help groups in a pretty specific setting then. But one can think about as the big and general question in this case to be the extent to which external actors can induce collective action and thereby improve public good provision in poor communities. And why should we care about this? Well, we know from the literature that poor communities generally tend to have poor provision of public goods, so it's interesting in itself. There's a direct value of learning more about this. There's also potential of instrumental value if we can learn a little bit more from these kind of studies about what types of interventions and what types of kind of facilitators potentially are more likely to be successful in actually increasing that public good provision and political activities within these poor communities. So just quickly the outline. As always, I have too many slides, so I'll probably try to run through a particular overview relatively quickly, because many of you probably know more about these things than I do. After the overview, we're going to talk a little bit about the intervention, program impact, behavioral games that we played, and some policy implications. But organizing the poor generally has become quite popular recently. If you look at just some institutions, such as the World Bank, for instance, there's been a lot of talk about what is referred to as community-based development programs in different ways. As much as $50 billion over the last 10 years have been allocated to what is referred to as local participatory projects. And of course, many of these projects and programs require a lot of engagement with the civil societies and NGOs. It's also true if we look at national governments. I mean, many national governments across the globe are putting a lot of emphasis on decentralization. They're putting a lot of emphasis on working together with NGOs and civil society, and putting a lot of emphasis on establishment and empowerment of local institutions. So we're bringing up some countries over there where this has been important, India being one of them. What about the literature trying to evaluate these kind of interventions? Well, there's not really a very clear consensus about the effect of these kind of organizations. If we focus particularly on self-help groups, since that's what I'm going to talk about, there are studies who have been arguing that they can lower poverty rates, they can have a positive impact on things such as consumption, as well as political participation and so on. And we mentioned some of these papers over here. And there's also related literature that deals with microfinance and political reservations and things like that, that also seem to suggest that they could have an impact. However, as many of you know, there are some potential methodological issues in many of these studies. One important limitation that is very much, of course, debated and discussed in the academic literature, and you here at FreeIE are very concerned about, has to do with endogenous program placement and the ability then to kind of define or identify a causal effect. And in most cases, these programs are not randomly placed, and for different reasons, you may choose to place them either in areas where you think the program should have a particularly large effect, or in areas where there is particular challenges, so therefore potentially it may be particularly important, but on the other hand, it may also be particularly hard to actually get effects. Another challenge, of course, in particular if you think about things such as political engagement, some of these interventions may take a long time. And it's often hard to get these kind of academic studies to take a long-term perspective. And there are also measurement issues, in particular in terms of things like political engagement. I mean, how do we really define that? How do we measure these kind of things? So what we are doing then in this paper then is that we're looking at the particular impact of these self-help groups on women and their communities as well. As you all know, these are very popular in India, something, according to a study from 2010, 90 million Indian households, mostly women in the households then, are engaged in something like 6 million different self-help groups. There's also a general political agenda and ambition to even increase that. So according to the Natural Rural Livelihood Mission, the ambition is to organize something like 150 million people into self-help groups up until 2050. How do self-help groups then typically work then? Well, one key thing then, as part of our research then, is that they're typically facilitated by an NGO, a government agency, or a bank. In our case, it's going to be an NGO. Typically consists of 10 to 20 women. It's not always women, but in many cases it's women. In our case, it's women. And the important thing is that they're working as a group to regularly save money and take turns borrowing from that saved money pot. In addition to that, there's often an attempt to link these saving schemes towards kind of formal credit markets in order to be able to get access to credit also from the outside. And in many cases, the NGOs or facilitators organizing these groups are also putting a lot of emphasis on other social issues, in particular women's issues or public service issues and things like that. So it's also, in addition to a potential effects on the livelihoods and economic outcomes, there's also an ambition to have an impact on the kind of political participation and political impact of, in particular, women in these villages. In our case, we've been working then with a particular NGO, the Self-Employed Women's Association, which has been at the forefront of this movement from quite early on. It began as a labor union for informal sector women, starting in 1972, and it now operates in 10 states with basically 1 million members. So what about the particular intervention that we are looking at? Well, the research setting is the Dungarpur district in southern Rajasthan. Rajasthan is a poor state. Dungarpur is a poor district in a poor state. 65% of the population are what is referred to as scheduled tribes. Per capita income in this district is approximately $312, whereas the state average is something like $420. 21% of the population is estimated to live below the rural poverty line, and at least in our sample, only 18% of the women are actually literate. So how did we do this intervention? Well, I alluded previously to some of the methodological problems in the academic studies who've been trying to do this. One being the sort of challenge then in identifying a causal mechanism, because the actual intervention of the villages picked as kind of treatment villages are not being randomly picked. But what we've managed to do, and I should really emphasize that Raj and Shireen managed to do initially, because I kind of got the creation a little bit later on in this process, was to have SEVA actually randomize the intervention of this particular program in these villages. So through a stratified process, in the end, we ended up with 80 villages, of which 48 were control villages and 32 were treatment villages. And of course, we had a baseline survey conducted before the actual intervention of the program. What about the intervention? Well, as is typically the case with these kind of interventions, it's a rather broad intervention. It's not only one simple thing that is done. From an academic perspective, that may be a challenge. We want to identify simple mechanisms and things like that. But this is more realistically what these kind of NGOs are doing and the way they are working. So it starts out with a membership and awareness drive at the village level. Then the self-help groups were established by women who volunteered and wanted to take part in these organizations then, within 3 months from the first from the first time the NGOs were showing up at these villages. And the way they were kind of organized was that the women should meet monthly and then save a certain amount of money, and it varied a little bit between different groups, between 25 and 100 rupees each individual in the group then, monthly.
Who organized this intervention?
The SEVA, the Self-Employed Women's Association, is the ones who are organizing the intervention. And the women then, as I said, save between 25 and 100 rupees a month. Take turn to be able to borrow the money from the sort of common pool then. And in some cases, these self-help groups have also been linked to formal banks, so they have the opportunity to actually borrow some additional money from the outside as well. And in addition to that, this particular specific savings mechanism, then, the facilitator is also helping out in the villages with different kind of employment and livelihoods programs, with childcare and some general counseling as well. So it's not just one single thing, there's kind of bundle of different kind of interventions. So what is the role of the NGO? I mean, I said in the beginning that we're kind of interested in looking at the role of an NGO and whether they can kind of increase public participation of these women in these villages and so on. Well, in theory, if we think about this from a kind of academic theorist or something like that, economic theorist, we would suggest that, or think that, if it really was in the interest of these women to organize in this way and start these kind of savings mechanisms, shouldn't they spontaneously organize these kind of groups themselves and start doing this? So what is really the role of the NGO in this case? Well, of course, if we turn away from theory and go to reality, there are of course a lot of different constraints that these women are facing in these villages in terms of their ability to actually form these groups and work together. I mean, it partly has to do with time constraints and things like that, but it also probably has a lot to do with different norms, you know, the role of women in the family and things like that. It may have to do with lack of education, but it also has to do with free riding, because much of what the kind of activities we're talking about here in terms of you know, political actions and things like that, it's really kind of a public good character kind of activity where if you take part of it, all the women potentially in the village are benefiting, but you bear the personal cost if you expend time and effort and so on to try to persuade the village council or politicians or bureaucrats to expend more resources of your particular village. So there are all these kind of different things. So what NGO then can do is that it can facilitate the organization of these kind of groups by reducing these kind of different constraints. Because they're coming from the outside, they're coming with some authority, they can convince, you know, village leadership and men and so on that this is a good idea. They can bring in some information to the women and some knowledge that may help them set these things up, and they can also create certain linkages to the outside world. So that's kind of the role the NGO can play. What about the self-help group mechanism in a sense though? Why should, you know, these women meeting every now and then and saving and so on, why should we really think that this should have an impact on political participation and the voice of women, you know, in terms of trying to raise awareness about public goods, deficiencies and so on in these villages? Well, the argument we are making is that it's a way of lowering cost of information and this sort of lack of coordination as well. I mean, this kind of repeated interaction creates an opportunity for these women to build some kind of trust in between themselves, because, you know, this particular mechanism really relies on the idea that you trust other women not to run away with a common goal, and that everybody actually contributes every time. So it creates potentially more trust, more kind of cooperative behavior, and given that, you know, political activities and political engagement in a way is a public good, this kind of trust can also help solve this kind of free riding problem, and therefore we can expect this women to be more politically active where we have these self-help groups being organized. And as I said before as well, I mean, you know, you can also get more access to labor and credit markets, which can also help these women in different ways. And it can also increase their bargaining power within the family if it means that they have access to more resources and they get more engaged in productive activities because they are able to invest in small things from the money they're getting from the savings groups. So what about program impact? Well, so we had surveys undertaken in 2007 then, you know, the baseline, and then of course an end-line survey, 2009, basically 2 years after the actual intervention was in place. Together that forms a pool cross-section. So we have the traditional, typical kind of impact evaluation set up in that sense. And we're basically comparing two different groups then. We're comparing the treated groups, which are the women in the villages in which the SEVA was organizing these self-help groups then. It was basically almost a little bit more than 1,400 women in that case. And then we had a control group, which were, you know, more villages. So we have almost 1,800 women who do not reside in SEVA villages as part of our control. And then we examined several different outcomes. Some of them simply having to do with whether, you know, does it really have an impact on the organization in different kind of village level groups. Because SEVA is of course not the only organization or organizing these groups, and they may exist in other villages as well. Also looking at different kind of economic outcomes, and also in terms of female empowerment within the household as well, household decision making. But what I'm going to talk in particular about today then has more to do with engagement with local government and preferences for village public goods as well. So that's what I'm going to emphasize here. But in some of the papers we have, we talk much more about also the other outcomes as well. And the key variable of interest for us then, of course, when they do their regressions and so on, is residents in a treatment village. So this is basically just a balance table that is showing that, you know, across basically these different observable variables, at least if you're looking at the means, women in the control villages and the treatment villages are basically the same. So we looked at the intent to treat effect, of course, because, you know, we cannot force, you know, not all women who are in treatment villages are, of course, not members of actual self-help groups. It's a voluntary thing, right? So we can only look at the intent to treat. And all the observations here are basically disaggregated at 4 different levels. So, you know, we define them according to which household you belong to, which village you belong to, what block your village belongs to, and there's also a time dimension, the pre and post intervention in this case. And we're running then regressions where we have a treatment dummy, a post-intervention dummy, and then the interaction between the two, which is really the sort of key variable that we're looking at in terms of defining the impact of the intervention then. A vector of different control variables that are specified below here. I'm not going to count all of them. And also block fixed effects as well. So what do we find then? Well, there's a lot of numbers here and a lot of columns and rows. We should really focus on two different things. Column 1, or rather perhaps column 5, where we have the conditional estimates, that gives you the actual interaction effect, which is a key thing. And there are two particular outcomes I want to emphasize here that has to do with this public good provision and political participation. So the first one is what we refer to as grievance water here. And that basically measures the extent to which the women in these villages are aware of where they should file grievances if they're not happy with water provision and so on. And the key thing then is that we're seeing a positive and statistically significant effect on this interaction term, suggesting that women in treatment villages after the intervention are more likely than the control group to actually be aware about where to feel these kind of grievances. The other one variable here has to do with addressed grievances. So that is to take it one more step and say, you don't just being aware about the fact that where you should go in order to feel these kind of grievances. Do you actually take some action to try to change things? Do you actually take contact with these people and try to do something about it? And once again, we're finding a positive and not very strongly significant, but still statistically significant effect of our interaction values in this case. Looking at other variables for public goods, such as roads and so on, we do not find any kind of significant effects. So where we do find an effect in terms of public goods provision then and information and so on, has to do with water. We also see that actual access to water is improved as well. So these are basically similar kind of regression, but now at the village level rather than at the individual level. And we're looking at the extent to which people are responding that access to water is very bad in this village. The question about whether individuals have access to piped water, and the extent to which they rely primarily on surface and rainwater. And once again, it's the first column that is of interest here, which is the interaction effect. And what you do find then is that in treatment villages, post-treatment then, there's a significantly smaller probability that individuals or women are identifying the water situation as very bad. On the other hand, there's a significant positive impact in terms of having access to piped water. And there's also significant negative effect in terms of the reliance on surface and rainwater. So it seems like there's actually also an improved water situation in these treatment villages post-intervention. So why water then? Well, Rajasthan is a very hot, dry and arid desert. So this is basically, and we know that from other research as well, this is the type of public good that women in these villages seem to care most about. So it kind of makes sense. But how should we really interpret these results? I mean, if we think about it from the perspective of the impact of the NGO or the facilitator, why do we see this effect? Well, what we want to try to argue then and so on, and what I've been arguing, is that it may have to do with the emergence of trust and cooperative behavior because of this repeated interaction between these things. But on the other hand, when you think about it, it's not the only potential explanation. Maybe it simply has to do with the fact that when you have these facilitators coming into the village, they give you some information about how to do these things. They may also, every time they show up, nudge you and tell you, you have to do something about this, you have to do something about this, and so on. And basically, kind of making the women go after the providers and making sure that something potentially happens. If that is the case, it's kind of positive, it has an impact, but it may not be a sustainable effect. Once the NGOs or the facilitators are leaving the villages, maybe everything disappears, right? Maybe women kind of get disengaged again. So therefore it would be interesting and important to know if it's one or the other. Another potential argument or a potential concern that has been raised in this literature on self-help groups as well is that they may work as a bit of a vehicle for elite capture as well. It may be the women who are already relatively influential and relatively well off in the villages who kind of capture these self-help groups to impose their own agenda, which may not necessarily be the same agenda as other women in these villages. If that is true, these kind of sort of organizations may actually increase inequality within the village and so on. So, you know, we want to get a sense of whether it's been driven by co-alignment or on preferences around the lead group members. So how can we kind of tell something about these different alternative interpretations? Well, what we did to try to identify whether there really was an effect on trust and cooperation was that we played some simple public goods games. So this is, you know, simple game theory played in these villages, which of course is a bit of a challenge and so on, but it worked out relatively well. So we did this in 14 of these villages, 7 treatment villages and 7 control villages. And it's a very simple provision point public goods game that works basically as follows. So it's all anonymous. I find that word very hard for some reason. Anonymous. So the women do not know what the other women are doing, right? That's important. So every woman is given 20 rupees at the start of this stage game, and she gets to make a choice of how much of that is she going to keep for herself, and how much is she going to contribute to a common pool. Okay? Then, when everybody has made their decisions, the common pool is summarized, and if that common pool exceeds a certain threshold, and this is a threshold that was known by everybody in this group who was playing this game, then this sum is multiplied by 2 and given back in equal proportion to all of the women within this group. Okay? If the sum does not exceed a threshold, all the money is gone. So you basically lost it. So there are a couple of things to note about this kind of setup of the game. The first thing is that there's strong incentives for free riding here. Even if you're providing to the common pool and you are actually exceeding the threshold, that last rupee that you contributed to the common pool is multiplied by 2, but then is divided up between all 10 or 12 of you, so it's actually not rational for you to provide any resources. Okay? So there's strong incentives for free riding. The other thing to note is that given that we have this provision point, this threshold here, it also means that your incentives to give money into the common pool is also going to depend on the extent to which you trust others to contribute to this common pool. And the more you trust others to pay to it, the more likely you are to pay to it as well, because at least then the money doesn't go completely to waste. Okay? Theoretically, there are 2 types of Nash equilibrium of this game. One is that nobody gives anything into the common pool. The other one is that the sort of subset or the full set of players of the game are contributing just enough to reach the actual threshold, but nothing more. Okay? In reality, of course, people are not acting according to that. But that's kind of what Nash equilibrium suggests. What do we think then? Well, we expect, in particular when we look at the first round, so this is played repeated times, I should say as well. In particular in the first round, where the kind of incentives or the kind of trust and cooperation incentives are the most clear.
My understanding is that since Seva is the NGO, all women in the treatment villages were Seva members, no?
No, not all of them. So in these games, in treatment villages, where Seva has been organizing self-help groups, most of the women taking part in the games were Seva members, but not all of them. Some were not. So we have also looked a little bit at the variation in game outcomes, depending on the proportion of actual Seva members within those groups. But we have relatively few observations. We only have 14 villages. So we can't make too much out of those results.
What is the proportion? How many Seva members, how many not Seva members?
I don't remember exactly. You remember?
On average, remember the group is open to all members of the village, but there's no requirement. So if you look at the actual population of eligible women in the villages, it's anywhere from, I think the lowest was something like 30–40% to close to 90% or something.
90%?
In some smaller villages. Remember, they're stratified by population, so it's very small villages in the group. But in this behavioral games, it was typically the case that there may be, out of a group of 10 women, there may have been 3 or 4 non-members on average.
And in the control villages, there were no seva members.
No seva. Because control villages has no seva presence.
The reason I'm asking, I spent over 18 years at Ahmedabad, and seva started Ahmedabad.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I happen to know the person who started the whole thing.
Yeah.
So I get a feeling that if you happen to be a seva member, the intended outcomes are likely to be realized.
That's probably correct in Gujarat, but this is Dungarpur, where seva had absolutely no presence.
But Dungarpur is not far away from Gujarat.
True, but it's a different group of women than seva has traditionally worked with, and until 2007, there was absolutely no seva presence in Rajasthan.
Okay, let's continue so that we can get to the end and
We
then
have
everyone will
a few
have a
more
chance
slides,
to...
but then I'm going to be done, so I'm sorry if I'm taking too much time.
No, that's fine. You're fine.
So our hypothesis then starting this is that if we look at the first round of the game in particular, then we do expect that seva members should contribute more than non-members. And we also expect that seva village residents should contribute more. And I mean, that's partly simply because they have seva members in the group, but it's also that village residents who are not seva members may suspect that seva members are likely to contribute more, and therefore they may be willing to contribute more as well, even if they've not been kind of treated to this kind of trust game and so on through the actual self. When we look at the subsequent rounds as well, I mean, once the first round is played, there's a learning mechanism that kicks in as well. So you learn something about the other players and maybe how the game is actually played. So we should expect to see differences, as the game evolves. And in particular, what we do expect to find then is that non-seva members in seva villages are starting to mimic the behavior of seva members and contribute more money as well. And here are just some pictures of our colleague Shireen, so she can be with us as well, when she's trying to organize these games and talking to the women in the villages about what this game is all about. And once again, this is a balance table just showing that players within control and treatment villages are basically similar across different kind of observable characteristics. What do we find in terms of the first round contributions then? Well, the first up on the top, we have the average contribution in round one of seva members. The second part is non-members, but in seva villages. And the lower parts are non-members in the control villages with no seva presence. And as you can see, averages are the highest among seva members and the lowest within the control villages. The differences are always statistically significant if we compare seva members to the others, but still, there's quite substantial differences in terms of the contributions, as we can anticipate in this case. If we look at the evolution over time, so here we have the round number on the x-axis, and then we have the average contribution on the y-axis, and we have the solid line. So one line cannot really be seen, but we have the solid line here. Now I'm going out of the picture, sorry. Representing seva members. We have this line over here that barely can be seen. It goes something like this. Those are non-members in seva villages, and these are the control villages. And one thing that you can see that once again is that in the first round, there's a clear distinction between seva members and others, whereas in the second round, the difference between seva members and seva villages and treatment villages persists, whereas non-members in seva villages are quickly mimicking the behavior of the seva members and increases their contributions. They're even overshooting them for 1 or 2 periods and then kind of converging towards the same level of contributions. And the way we had it set up was that at the point in time where all the players were basically contributing to the full amount, then we start the game. And what we can see here as well is that if we look at treatment villages, the game ended with a shorter number of rounds of games as well, something about around 7, compared to the control villages as well. Final thing here I want to show as well is that if you look at the inequality of contribution, it also seemed to be somewhat lower in treatment villages. This is not a very clear effect, but you could argue that having had this repeated saving scheme where everybody basically contribute the same amount of money should make seva members more likely to contribute similar amounts each time when playing this game. And therefore we should expect to see kind of a lower variance or lower variation in terms of the individual contribution within the treatment villages compared to the control villages. And we're seeing a little bit of that, even though the distinction is not very clear-cut. And here basically the same thing, but now conditional results, doing regressions, controlling for some observable characteristics, but basically, we're finding the same things. So conclusions then, and thanks for your patience. What we do find, what we would argue then, is that we do find some evidence for that self-help groups organized by outsiders actually can influence these communities. I mean, as I said, we have shown in other sort of work that I'm presenting here that it also has some impact on economic outcomes and so on, and women's autonomy within the family and so on, and financial transactions. But of particular interest in this context then is that it also seemed to have some effect on the collective action of these women in these villages and the extent to which they are participating in public life and taking political actions. And it seems to also kind of have an effect. It seems to actually improve the delivery of public services, in particular in this case. And playing these games, what they seem to suggest then is that the way that this kind of intervention works, so the mechanism in this case, is that these kind of repeated interactions between these self-help group members create some kind of sort of incentives for cooperation, increases trust, reduces kind of free-riding problems in terms of political engagement and so on, and therefore these women are more likely to actually get engaged and improve the situation. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.